This is Dr. Garcia presenting Chapter 7, Asking People About Themselves, Conducting Survey Research, and this is for Psych 3040 Research Methods. Now, when we conduct survey research, it really gives us an opportunity to really allow people to tell about themselves. So it gives an opportunity for people to have a voice and be able to express their attitudes, their beliefs, their behaviors, their thoughts, their ideas. Maybe sometimes you might even be able to survey them about their memory and other cognitive processes, or maybe their emotions and the way that they feel. Survey research does reveal relationships between and among variables. For instance, how attitudes and behaviors change over time. Here's an example of survey research question when we're looking at just basic demographic information of participants of our studies. Which of the following best describes your current relationship status? Survey research is very useful in making public policy decisions. This is frequently used a lot to understand societal perspectives and perceptions on certain issues that might be happening in communities, in neighborhoods, in larger cities, counties, and even states. And it is a complement to experimental research. Now, most surveys are done online, and you will use Qualtrics as an online survey system as well. And not only that, as we said, it's a complement to experimental research. So I thought I'd do a quick review to understand experimental research. Although we do have a full chapter dedicated to this coming up in the next couple of weeks, I did want to go ahead and give a demonstration of experimental research so you can understand the difference between a survey research design and experimental research designs. And in this particular study, there was a group of people who were out of work. And so these groups of people who are out of work, some of them, they were kind of randomly assigned to do different populations. So the population is here, and they were randomly split into two different groups. One group got a workplace intervention program, so a work program that would allow them to increase their skill sets in interviewing and application writing and looking for jobs and the right types of job searches. And the other group that was split into two, right? So this other group was not really given any resources or a specialty work program, and this was the control group. So this group got the special intervention, this group did not. And then in the end, we compare the differences between the work program group and the non-work program group. And in this case, the difference was looking at whether or not the people found work. And everything is green are those that found work. So we can see that it appears that the intervention program was effective because there were more people who found work after receiving the work program. Again, interviewing skills, application development, job searching, how to do good job searches, and they were able to find more jobs than people who did not have any supported work program intervention. So this was our control group. So we compare these differences, and we are interested in finding out if there's a significant difference between the two, and if in fact the intervention played a role in looking at the effectiveness of the intervention and how it played a role in finding work. So that's what we mean by an experimental research. It does start with a population that is randomly assigned to two different groups. One group is receiving one experience, the other group is not receiving it, it's the control group, and then a comparison of outcomes is made by both. In survey research, you can look at the differences between two different groups, but you're not randomly splitting them into two different groups. You're not able to implement an intervention. You can. We did it with our information processing study experiment, but survey research usually isn't conducted that way. It's just asking people about themselves, their attitudes, their beliefs, their emotions, their thoughts, their cognitive processes about a host and a whole number of different variables that you might be interested in. Selecting measures is very important. A lot of you just completed this activity. You need to first define your research objectives, and many times you define your research objectives by identifying and really looking at that hypothesis. Hypothesis is an educated prediction that provides an explanation for an observed event, where an observed event must be measurable. Typically, the observed event is your dependent variable. So a hypothesis really helps you to start off with defining your research objectives, like what facts do you need to know? How do we operationalize these variables? What are the demographics in the population we're interested in? And again, the attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, mental processes, and emotions. So the hypotheses allows you to define your research objectives and really asking yourself, what is the topic of my research and who should answer your research survey? So really knowing your participants as well. So when you select a measure, as you notice, you have to have a very well written hypothesis. And this is something, even though we've done this particular lab activity, this is something that may need to be revisited again if your hypothesis is not as clean. Now, there's if-then statements that are hypotheses. There's an example one here. If you sleep less than 6 hours, then you will do better. If you sleep at least 6 hours, then you will do better on a test than with less sleep. Or if we increase the amount of light during studying, then participant test scores will decrease. Or this is very much with the type of hypotheses that we do in our class, in our research methods class, because it's a bit more sophisticated hypotheses where we're looking at the comparison or the differences between two different groups as it relates to a particular variable. So listening to hip hop rap will increase aggressive behaviors compared to listening to rock or blues. So this is more of a comparison hypothesis. So the most important thing here is when you select a measure, you have to make sure that you have a well-written and a well-defined hypotheses so that you can select the right measure. Now, even when you select a good measure, you have to critically evaluate the quality of the survey to make sure that it is really asking the questions that you needed to ask in relation to that hypothesis. If you find a measure you like, but you realize it's kind of missing the mark either through the language or it's asking a question that you're interested in but not specific or unique to your specific variables, you can always modify the measures. But when you're modifying measures, you must make sure that your participants understand the question that's being asked. If you have to revise or rewrite a question, you need to understand that there could be problems with that question if you're revising it. You can't use unfamiliar terminology. Your participants may not be as familiar with the technical terminology that can be used in the world of psychology. You have to have very precise terms. Nothing can be vague. Make sure that there's good grammatical structure. You can't have phrasing that overloads working memory. It needs to be simplified. It needs to be specific. And you can't embed a question with misleading information. So even when you select a measure, many times you may have to modify it and really think about what is this asking and how am I going to modify it, or maybe how I'm going to add a question or two to really capture what it is that I'm trying to ask from the perspective of my hypothesis. So when you construct questions, and if you do need to add questions, so sometimes you modify questions, sometimes you have to add questions, or sometimes you can just use the survey as is. But if you are constructing questions, simplicity is key. It's critical. You need to make sure that you are really asking explicitly and specifically in the most simplest terms what it is that you need to know. You want to avoid lack of clarity and precision. We've talked about that. You also need to avoid something called double-barreled questions. You cannot write questions that are asking two things in once. Like, for instance, how's the taste and appearance of your pancakes? You're asking two questions here. You're asking about taste and the appearance. That's a double-barreled question. You also can't ask a loaded question. Which of the following services urgently requires improvement? This kind of language is already priming someone and loading them up with giving in an answer that's urgent and must be required for improvement. Insensitive and negative wording can be problematic, and you're not going to always get the best results because people aren't going to answer your survey correctly if they feel some questions are insensitive, like how often do you copy another student's exam? So basically you're accusing students of cheating, and that would not be appropriate. Yay-saying and nay-saying questions are asking questions, for instance, cost should not be a factor when purchasing a car. You're sort of already, again, priming and leading them into saying yes or saying no without really deliberating or evaluating the question itself. So if you are going to construct some questions or you're going to add some questions to an existing measure, then you need to make sure that you're careful and not adding some of these problematic questions into your survey. This is just a resource for you to look at optimal survey design. So again, not only when you select a measure through PsycTest, you have to critically evaluate it. Does it have clarity? Does it seem to flow well? Does it have relevance to the audience that I'm looking for? Is it objective and it doesn't have some of those problems we just saw on the other page? What is the look and feel of the measure? This is going to be okay because you're going to transfer a lot of these measures that you're finding into Qualtrics, onto those online surveys. And then the question structures. You need to understand the question structures. Are they open-ended questions? Are they based on nominal data, ordinal data? Is there multiple choice? If it's multiple choice, there should be mutually exclusive. You probably won't have these issues because you are finding predetermined measures, but you should always just take a moment to think about your survey from the perspective of your participants. Now, there's a lot of different responses to questions. We have closed versus open-ended questions. Closed questions are things just like we see here. You just have to click a box to answer that question. It's a closed questions. If it's on a scale of 1 to 7, you pick 1, a 3, a 5, one of those numbers between 1 and 7. An open-ended question is when you ask a person a question and they tell you, they write you a story, or they write something up to give you feedback. That's an open-ended question. You need to think about the number of response alternatives as well, and the types of rating scales. And we mean by the response alternatives, how many responses can they provide for you? Is it a 5-point scale, a 3-point scale, a 7-point scale? How number of responses can they provide you with? The types of rating scales, this is an example of a graphic rating scale. What we mean a graphic rating scale, it has just like this visual or graphic ways of identifying a numerical scale. This is a semantic differential scale. Please tell us what you think about Anderson grocery stores. From clean to dirty, strongly described, no opinion, strongly describes. See, this is a semantic differential scale where you're using wording like convenient and inconvenient, inexpensive, expensive. You can also have a nonverbal scale as well. Nonverbal scales are typically used for children. And then you can also have labeling response alternatives where there really isn't a number, like on a scale of 1 to 10. You click 5, click 4, click 3. You're just answering by a label and people respond to those alternatives. Formatting, again, especially when you transfer these into Qualtrics, you need to make sure it's attractive, looks professional, that there's no grammatical errors, no typos, that your consistent scaling is the same. You have a consistent point scale, and your cues are well refined. Again, if you're using pre-existing measures, fine, you can do that. But if you're modifying a measure or you're adding new questions and constructing new questions for that measure, then you need to make sure your questions are well refined. When you administer surveys, you're going to do either questionnaires. Mail surveys are very rare nowadays. You can personally administer them to groups or individuals. When we were on campus, this is a very frequent method that students would use. We'd go into classrooms and ask students to please complete a survey. Internet and social media surveys are more likely the choice for most students, and really the only choice now during the pandemic. And then we have interviews that can be conducted to administer surveys, face-to-face, telephone, and focus group interviews as well. Now, there's a lot of different ways that we can do sampling. Let me move some of these things out of the way here. And sampling techniques, whoops, let's go here. This is a form of sampling techniques or stratified sampling techniques. You have a lot of different people in your groups. You break them up into different groups, and then you stratify different people to be a part of your study. So you have a population of people, and you stratify them into these groups. And maybe this is a group of males, and this is a group of females, and this is a group of non-binary females, and these are non-binary biologically sexed males. And so from that, you place them into specific groups or stratify them into specific groups by which they belong, and then you select one from each of these stratified groups so that you have some randomness, because again, you can't necessarily randomly select your population, but you can kind of understand, like, I'm going to go to the 3rd grade classroom and I'm going to pick only the boys. And so you select one boy from there, and then go to a 4th grade classroom and only pick a girl. Then go to the same 4th grade classroom and go pick a boy, and then go to a 5th grade classroom and pick a girl. So it's just a way to have people in these specific groups that they may belong to and then have a sample from them. Now there's a cluster population is very similar to that, where you take groups of people and you cluster them into groupings as well. And then you select this cluster and maybe this cluster. You randomly select clusters. This is just a way of grouping people together and saying, I'm going to put people, these two are going to be in a cluster, these two are a cluster, these two are a cluster, and so on and so forth. I only need 4 people in my study, and I'm going to randomly select 2 clusters because I only need 4 people in my study. So I'm taking this cluster and randomly selected this cluster, and that's how you can gain those as well. So these are probability sampling techniques. Now, sampling from a population is very important. When we take a look at a population and we pull a sample from that population, what we're doing here is we're trying to say that from this sample, because we've randomly, as best as we could, tried to randomly select them to be a part of our studies, we can say with a certain confidence that the sample is a representative of the true population. So again, we could never assess and survey all Cal State LA college undergrad college students in the psychology department. That would be impossible. But we can take a sample from that population, and we want to use our confidence intervals to have at least 95% confidence that that sample that we've pulled from that larger population of undergraduate psychology students or psychology major students, that we have some level of confidence that our sample results are representative of the true population. And we use this with our confidence intervals. And our confidence intervals, for example, if our sample on average earns a 61%, if our confidence intervals then would tell us that somewhere the rest of the true population, the real population, again, we can't really measure everyone, but the true population would have a score of somewhere between 58% and 64%. And so our sample is at 61%, and our true population would have a very similar score, somewhere between 58 to 64%. So this takes into consideration some sampling error. Remember that term from statistics you might have, or margin of error, more likely this was the term. Because since we're just using samples of a larger true population, we recognize that there may be some errors. They are never going to be an exact specific replication of the population, but it's going to be fairly close. It's going to be a fairly good representation with just a small margin of error. The one thing you can do is, guess what? Your large sample size reduces that confidence interval. So this interval becomes smaller and smaller. You do have to consider, though, the cost and benefits of increasing your sample size, but for the most part, it will help you to have a better sample that is a strong representation of your population. Now, there are non-probability sampling techniques, and unfortunately right now, given the circumstances of the pandemic, we will more likely use haphazard sampling or convenience sampling. You will do some snowball sampling where you go ahead and distribute out your survey and links to your survey into social media platforms, or maybe ask friends or text friends and say, hey, send this out to anyone you know. That's called convenience sampling. Purpose of sampling is samples meets predetermined criteria. So let's say perhaps you're interested in finding out about how people feel or jealousy levels in social media. So the person has to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. So there have to be predetermined criterion. Quota sampling is just basically that the sample reflects a specific numerical composition. So for instance, you're interested in looking at gender, 10 males, 10 females, and 10 who identify as non-binary. So this is quota sampling. You know you need a minimum of 10 males, 10 females, and 10 non-binary. Now, when you're evaluating your samples, your sampling frame, your actual population from which the sample is drawn, you need to take that into consideration. Who is my participant? Who is my population? Who are the people that are going to be in my study? And that is your sampling frame. Your response rate is the percentage of respondents who actually complete the survey. Again, using convenience sample. And you need to make sure that any concerns that you have are resolved, because if there are any issues or concerns in collecting the data, whether it's through how the questions are designed, how you select your sample, then you may not be able to generalize the results of your study to the rest of the population. And that ends our chapter for Psych 3040, Chapter 7 on Survey Research.